In the cold stone corridors of medieval England, power was never secured by swords alone. Sanity was fragile, and for one king, that fragile line would snap. His reign became not rule, but a slow, agonizing collapse into something far darker. This is the unflinching descent of Henry VI, the Mad King. The year was 1421. England basked in triumph. Across foreign fields, the blood of her enemies soaked into conquered soil. At the helm stood King Henry V, the Lion of Agincourt warrior king, embodiment of English might. But glory is greedy, and victory has a price. Behind the towering palace gates, death slipped silently into the king's chamber. His breaths turned shallow, desperate. His body, once invincible, twitched violently under waves of fever. Skin blistered, lips cracked. Every rasping exhale sounded like the echo of a war drum growing fainter. The healers tried in vain. Leeches clung to pale flesh. Herbal poultices rotted on open wounds. The prayers of priests grew quieter with each failed ritual, as if even God had withdrawn. But outside the chamber, grief wore a different mask. It whispered. The Beauforts spoke in hushed corners. The Duke of Gloucester narrowed his eyes. The Yorkists sharpened invisible blades behind hollow oaths of loyalty. The king's death would not simply be an end, it would open a void. And power abhors a vacuum. When Henry V finally exhaled his last tortured breath, the mighty lion was gone. Into the silence was placed a fragile child, Henry VI, barely 1 year old, unaware, unprotected. The weight of 2 crowns, England and France, now rested on a head too small to hold either. The nobles knelt before the baby king, but their loyalty was not to him. Their loyalty was to opportunity. The throne was still warm. The real war had just begun, a war not of armies, but of whispers. In every kingdom, some dangers wear armor and wield swords, but the most dangerous threats often wear silk, speak softly, and move behind closed doors. The years crept forward, but Henry VI did not grow into the King England so desperately needed. While his body grew taller, his spirit remained fragile, delicate as glass under pressure. Where other boys of noble blood learned to fight, to hunt, to rule, Henry retreated. He found comfort only in prayer. Hour after hour, he would kneel silently in candlelit chambers, clutching his rosary beads, whispering quiet pleas into the shadows. His wide eyes drifted, not toward his tutors or advisors, but toward empty corners of the room, as if listening for voices no one else could hear. Servants passing his chambers spoke in hushed tones. They claimed they heard him late at night, murmuring to the darkness, not in childish babble, but in broken apologies, as though answering accusations that no one had made aloud. The clergy debated among themselves. Some insisted this was divine sensitivity, a boy deeply touched by God's hand, but others, behind closed doors, exchanged uneasy glances. There was something unsettling about this quiet child, something hollow and vulnerable. But for the nobility, Henry's fragility meant something very different. It meant opportunity. The Beaufort faction, led by Cardinal Beaufort himself, closed in like vines wrapping around the throne. With each passing month, they extended their influence, guiding appointments, shaping decisions, shielding the king under the guise of protection. Protection always demands obedience. The Duke of Gloucester watched the tightening circle with growing alarm. As uncle and protector, He had once stood close to the boy king, but his warnings about excessive Beaufort control fell on increasingly deaf ears. One by one, his allies drifted away or were quietly removed from positions of power. Far to the north, Richard, Duke of York, observed this slow decay with careful calculation. He understood something the others refused to admit. As long as Henry remained weak, as long as the court remained fractured, the stage was being prepared not for stability, but for something far darker. Power was being hoarded, and resentment was quietly fermenting. By day, the court presented a mask of harmony, nobles smiling, bowing, exchanging polite words. But at night, the corridors whispered. Alliances shifted in candlelit chambers. Marriage contracts became weapons. Promises made in secret began to outweigh oaths sworn in public. Inside his own mind, Henry drifted further into quiet isolation. Each day, he seemed to retreat slightly more from the world around him, while those closest to him fought bitterly for control of the kingdom he could not command. The whispers grew louder. The walls of Westminster absorbed every word. And though Henry VI heard none of the political games unfolding around him, another kind of whisper was beginning to take root inside his head, a quieter, more insidious kind. And as the nobles pulled at the threads of power, across the sea, a new player was preparing to step into this tangled game, one who would weave a far more dangerous web than any before her. Sometimes the most dangerous weapons aren't blades or armies. Sometimes they arrive dressed in silk, wearing polite smiles, and never need to raise their voices to conquer. By 1445, the palace had become a garden of quiet schemes. The boy king was now a young man in years, but his soul remained fragile. While England yearned for a leader, Henry VI remained lost, drawn more to quiet prayers than decisive rule. His aversion to conflict was almost unnatural for a king. He avoided harsh words as if they burned his skin. In modern times, we often romanticize gentle rulers, those who seek peace, who turn from war. But medieval England was no place for softness. This was a world where power wasn't given, it was seized, clawed for, protected with blood. And in such a world, mercy wasn't virtue, it was vulnerability. And into that world stepped Margaret of Anjou. At just 15, she arrived from France, not as a frightened bride, but as a strategist trained from birth to navigate dangerous courts. In a palace full of men twice her age, she read them like open books. But it was Henry who caught her attention most. Here stood a king unable to wield power, uncomfortable even in his own crown. His smile was tender, his voice soft, but his hands trembled with the weight of decisions. Margaret recognized it instantly. He will not rule, but through him I can. At first, Margaret presented herself as the perfect consort, obedient, charming, gracious in public. But behind the silk veils, she moved like a spider, quietly spinning threads into places others overlooked. The Beaufort faction, already dominant, welcomed her warmly. They saw in her not a rival, but a reinforcement to their growing grip. And Margaret rewarded their loyalty by pulling the strings even tighter. Court appointments shifted subtly. Dissenters were politely edged out. New marriages were arranged to secure alliances. The council gradually filled with those whose loyalty wasn't to Henry, but to her. The Duke of Gloucester, once protector, sensed the tightening noose. His warnings about foreign manipulation fell heavier with each passing month, but fewer ears were left to hear him. His allies diminished, replaced by faces loyal to the Queen. Richard, Duke of York, watched from afar. But while others grew anxious, York grew patient. The more Margaret tightened her grip, the more brittle the court became. And brittle things, no matter how ornate, crack under pressure. Meanwhile, Henry retreated further into his prayers. While his wife orchestrated power, he clung to scripture. "Guide me, Lord, protect us, deliver us from evil." He whispered into the darkness of his chambers, but the evil was already inside. It didn't storm the gates. It walked quietly through the halls, wearing smiles and speaking softly. Margaret's network expanded into every crevice of governance. She did not simply influence the throne, she wore it. The king remained the symbol. She became the hand that moved it. And yet, no web, no matter how intricate, can hold forever. Beneath the palace's polished floors, rot was already spreading, unseen, but inevitable. When a kingdom rots, it never happens all at once. It begins quietly with small cracks, the kind you can ignore at first, until one day the whole foundation gives way. By the early 1450s, those cracks were everywhere. At first glance, the kingdom still looked intact. The ceremonies continued. The courts remained polished. The banners still flew. But beneath the surface, England was unraveling. Land disputes between nobles, once handled with decorum, now spiraled into violent private feuds. Lords raised personal armies. Families who had once shared wine at royal banquets now eyed each other across blood-soaked fields. Old grudges, long buried, resurfaced with renewed venom. The court itself grew colder. Meetings of council, once filled with lively debate, had become stiff performances. Nobles exchanged rehearsed speeches while studying each other's faces like chess opponents searching for weaknesses. At the center of it all sat Henry VI, or rather, drifted. His presence became more symbolic than functional. He would attend council sessions, but often spoke in halting phrases, staring into corners of the room as if someone stood there beyond anyone's sight. At times, his voice trailed into whispered prayers mid-discussion. His ministers would politely pause, waiting for him to finish, exchanging glances that carried more meaning than words. From a human lens, if we imagine this in today's world, it's as if a nation's leader showed up to critical cabinet meetings, sat at the head of the table, but occasionally froze, eyes wide, mumbling quietly while his staff continued business as usual. The machinery of state kept moving, but no one truly believed the driver was still holding the wheel. At night, the palace heard him, the muffled wails, the shuffling steps along cold stone floors. Servants found the king kneeling, sometimes clawing at the marble with cracked nails, sweat pouring from his face, lips trembling in confusion. His body shook as though fighting off hands only he could feel. Physicians, still chained to the limited knowledge of their age, responded with bloodletting, leeches, and thick, foul-smelling concoctions. Priests performed exorcisms, believing dark spirits were gnawing at the king's soul. But neither medicine nor prayer could repair what was slipping away inside his mind. Margaret, now fully in control, clutched tightly to what remained of the monarchy. The more Henry receded, the more aggressively she expanded her authority, arranging marriages, rewarding loyalists, and ensuring that only those devoted to her remained close to power. But the kingdom could sense it, the nobility could sense it, even the commoners could sense it. Power was being hoarded, and resentment was fermenting just beneath the surface. Richard of York, ever patient, saw the rot for what it was. The more Margaret pushed, the more brittle the structure became. The moment to strike was approaching, and still Henry prayed, but every structure, no matter how carefully patched, reaches its breaking point. For Henry VI, that breaking point was now closer than anyone dared admit. A mind can endure pressure for years. It can bend under weight, twist under strain, but when it finally breaks, it shatters all at once. For years, Henry VI had struggled quietly against the growing shadows inside his mind. But in the summer of 1453, that struggle came to an abrupt and terrifying end. The news arrived from France. Gascony lost. The last remnants of his father's conquests had crumbled into dust. The weight of failure crushed what little stability Henry had managed to cling to. His mind didn't spiral downward, it simply detached. One morning he fell into complete silence, not the quiet reflection of prayer, not the polite hesitation his counsel had grown used to. This was something deeper. His eyes stared forward, glassy and unblinking. His limbs hung loose, his body still breathing but void of life. Ministers addressed him but received no answer. The cries of his newborn son, placed gently into his arms, stirred nothing. For 17 months, Henry sat like a breathing statue. He ate only when fed. He moved only when guided. His mouth occasionally twitched, forming shapes that resembled words but carried no meaning. At night, faint murmurs slipped from his lips, fractured fragments of thought, drifting like fog across an abandoned field. They called from beneath, scratching, pulling. The royal physicians were baffled. They called it the king's illness. The priests returned, chanting prayers, casting holy water, pleading for divine mercy. But there was nothing to cure, nothing left to heal. The court became paralyzed. Margaret ruled entirely in his name, but every decision was haunted by the ghost of what stood beside her. A king who still breathed, but was no longer there. Nobles whispered in growing panic. England was adrift, captainless, and beyond the palace, the vultures circled. Richard of York saw his moment drawing closer. The realm teetered. The lines between loyalty and rebellion blurred. All it would take now was a single spark. One sudden shift, and the kingdom would fall into open war. The spark was already coming, and when it arrived, England would devour itself. Sometimes kingdoms do not collapse from invaders at their gates. Sometimes they eat themselves from within. The paralysis at court could not last forever. With Henry VI lost inside his silent prison of the mind, the factions that had quietly sharpened their blades now stepped into open conflict. The fragile threads that Margaret had woven around her husband's throne began snapping, one by one. The nobles divided. Some pledged loyalty to Margaret's rule, clinging to the crumbling remnants of Lancastrian power. Others, sensing weakness, turned to Richard of York, who no longer bothered to hide his ambitions. York's call was simple: restore order, restore balance, restore strong leadership. But behind his noble rhetoric lay ambition as sharp as any sword. The War of the Roses erupted. At St. Albans, the first clash of arms stained the cobblestones red. What began as a dispute between nobles quickly unraveled into full civil war. Brother against brother, father against son, families splintered, not by foreign enemies, but by shifting loyalties within their own bloodlines. Fields that once yielded wheat became graveyards. Church bells tolled not for celebration, but for the counting of the dead. And still, at the center of this storm, sat Henry VI, silent, hollow. He wandered through encampments barefoot, murmuring prayers as battle lines formed around him. Some soldiers claimed they saw him speaking to trees, blessing rocks, whispering to the wind, as if hearing voices only he could perceive. The ground drinks deeply, it's never full. The voices crawl beneath my feet. The kingdom burned. England became a grotesque theater where ambition danced hand in hand with betrayal, and the common people suffered beneath the boots of men who claimed to serve their king, yet served only themselves. And as the fires of war grew, Henry's mind drifted further into shadows even darker than the battlefields that now littered his kingdom. But even civil wars have turning points. And soon, Henry VI would find himself locked away, not just within his mind, but within England's most infamous stone prison. There are prisons made of stone, and then there are prisons made of the mind. For Henry VI, both would soon become one. In 1461, Edward of York seized the throne. His armies crushed the Lancastrian resistance at Towton in a slaughter so brutal, the rivers ran red for days. Margaret fled into exile, and Henry, he was found wandering the northern woods like a ghost. When Yorkist soldiers captured him, they expected defiance, but the king offered none. He simply stared at them, smiling faintly as though relieved. "Am I to meet my father now?" he whispered. "Perhaps the voices will be quiet there." But they did not execute him. Death would have been mercy. Instead, they dragged him to the Tower of London, England's ancient fortress of silence. The tower was no stranger to suffering. Its thick, damp walls had swallowed countless souls before him, but none like this. Henry was locked in a small, lightless cell. Narrow slits in the stone allowed only thin streaks of cold light. The air reeked of rot and mold. Rats scurried boldly across his straw bedding, nibbling at scraps as he stared into nothing. At night, his guards heard him, faint whimpers, broken prayers, shuddering gasps. His body wasted away. The sores on his back festered. His hair fell in clumps. His skin sagged like wet parchment over brittle bones. The once king whispered to the rats as though they were old friends. "You are fortunate. You hear no whispers. You feel no pulling." Even hardened guards refused to enter his cell alone. They whispered among themselves of unnatural chills, of shadows that seemed to move when no one stood near. Margaret, from afar, tried to rebuild. But inside the tower, Henry's world shrank further with every breath. And yet, even this horror was not the end. The wheel of power would turn once more, offering Henry one final, cruel mockery of a crown. Some revivals feel like miracles, others feel like cruel jokes. In 1470, an unexpected alliance turned the tide. Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, once York's strongest ally, betrayed Edward and, together with Margaret, restored Henry VI to the throne. It was, by appearance, a victory, but only by appearance. The coronation ceremony resumed with all its hollow grandeur. The crown was placed upon Henry's thinning, patchy hair, trumpets blared, banners unfurled, and Henry sat there unmoving. His eyes stared into the distance as ministers spoke before him, their words drifting into a void where meaning no longer reached. He was no longer a king, he was a prop, a symbol propped upright while others ruled in his name. Those who had fought for his return whispered among themselves in private, "Is this what we fought for?" Margaret, however, had no choice but to press forward. She held the regency with fierce determination, controlling decisions behind the scenes. But the kingdom, even under Yorkist defeat, remained unstable, and fragile victories rarely last. In rare moments of awareness, Henry would speak softly, his voice barely audible. "Are they gone yet? The faces, they still wait beneath." Whispering still. The illusion of restoration did not fool many. Edward of York regrouped quickly. His exiled forces returned with renewed strength, and as they marched back toward London, the fragile Lancastrian resurgence trembled under its own weight. Henry's second reign was not a return to power, it was the prelude to the final fall. The last chapter of this long tragedy was now at hand, and for Henry VI, the descent was about to reach its coldest depths. Sometimes the cruelest endings don't arrive like storms. They arrive like a slow, quiet suffocation long before anyone realizes hope is already dead. Edward of York returned with brutal speed. The brief illusion of Lancastrian restoration shattered like fragile glass beneath a hammer. Margaret's final army assembled desperately at Tewkesbury. It was no longer a battle for victory, but for survival. The clash was merciless. Lancastrian banners fell one after another, bodies piled across the fields, and when the dust finally settled, the last thread of Henry's bloodline lay broken. His son, Prince Edward, was cut down. The last hope for a Lancastrian dynasty died with him. When word of his son's death reached Henry in the Tower, there was no cry of agony, no collapse, just a long, hollow stare. He sat for hours, unmoving. And then, almost as if speaking to no one, he whispered, "I knew." They whispered to him too, the voices, they take everyone. The little life that had once flickered inside him faded into something barely human. His body decayed rapidly. The sores on his skin grew deeper, oozing pus and blood. Open wounds festered, attracting flies that buzzed ceaselessly in the damp cell. His breathing grew labored, raspy, as though every inhale scraped across raw stone inside his chest. The Tower guards, hardened men who had witnessed horrors before, now avoided his cell. Some whispered that his very presence chilled the air unnaturally, that at night, faint whispers could be heard even when he wasn't speaking, as if the stone itself remembered his madness. "They crawl inside my bones, chewing from within. They're never satisfied." By now, the kingdom had moved on. Edward's banners flew high. The Yorkist regime solidified its control. The name Henry VI was rarely spoken outside those walls. He had become an afterthought, a haunting shadow everyone wanted to forget. But inside his cold tomb of stone, Henry remained, still breathing, still rotting, still trapped inside a mind that had long since collapsed. But even shadows fade. And for Henry VI, mercy, cold, final mercy, was now quietly approaching. Not all executions happen in public. Some are done quietly, in places designed to swallow history whole. May 1471, under the cover of darkness, two hooded figures entered the Tower. They moved silently, their task long decided. There would be no trial, no audience, no proclamation. Henry lay on his straw bedding, his body thin and brittle like a broken marionette. His hollow eyes fluttered weakly as the men approached. For a brief moment, a faint smile trembled at the edge of his cracked lips, as though he recognized what was coming. "Ah, you've come at last. Perhaps now the whispers will be quiet." They said nothing. One held him gently by the shoulders, pinning the fragile body down. The other drew a thin blade, not a sword fit for a king's death, but a tool of quiet precision. The dagger slipped behind his ear, sliding through flesh and bone with a wet crunch. His body jerked once, as though expelling one last trapped breath. "They're pulling me, pulling." And then silence. His chest sagged, his hollow eyes froze open. The tower swallowed his final breath into its stone belly. There was no grand procession, no public mourning, no hymns for England's lost king. At dawn, his corpse was carted out quietly, like refuse cleared before the city awoke. Buried with little ceremony, moved years later to a quieter grave, as though even death was embarrassed to claim him. Henry VI, crowned as a child, consumed by whispers, was gone. In the end, it wasn't rebellion that destroyed him. It wasn't the sword, nor the armies, nor the politics. It was his own mind, a locked chamber of whispers that no one else could hear. And as England marched forward beneath new banners, few spoke his name again. But deep within the tower's ancient stones, his tragedy lingered, a quiet reminder of how power can rot even the gentlest souls. Power rarely destroys through grand explosions. More often, it decays slowly, eating from within, hollowing its victim long before the world notices. Henry VI ruled for decades, but he never truly reigned. He wore the crown, but never held the power. Surrounded by wolves in silk, he drifted too gentle for the world that demanded teeth. His enemies raised armies, his allies betrayed him, but in the end, none of them delivered the final blow. The deadliest enemy lived inside his own skull, whispering, digging, pulling him apart one silent day after another. When people speak of mad kings, they often imagine tyrants, cruel men driven to monstrous acts. But Henry's madness was different. It wasn't rage. It was surrender, a slow unraveling of a soul too fragile to carry the weight of a kingdom. And though his body was finally laid to rest, his tragedy remains, echoing through the cold stones of history, reminding us that not all kings are built for crowns. Some are born only to break beneath them.